spooky place.
You ever get that feeling that someone's watching you, just out of sight, just beyond your reach, but when you turn around, there's nothing there? Well, after this story, you won't just feel it, you'll know it. And trust me, you won't be getting a good night's sleep tonight. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The Smiling Man. Detective Rachel Monroe had always been a woman of steel nerves, her resolve unshakable even in the face of the most gruesome crimes. But the Smiling Man, his work was something else entirely. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders that chilled her to the bone. It was the artistry, the deliberate, almost ritualistic way he turned his victims into grotesque masterpieces. Each scene was a macabre tableau, a twisted joke only he seemed to understand. And now, he had set his sights on her. The first body had been discovered in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. A young woman, her lifeless body seated at a dining table, hands delicately cradling a porcelain teacup. Her face had been carved into a wide, unnatural grin, her lips stretched back to reveal teeth stained with blood. The scene was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. And then there was the note, scrawled in elegant handwriting. Laugh with me. The second victim was an older man, found in a rundown motel room. He was posed on a moth-eaten armchair, his head tilted back, as if he were watching a comedy on the room's dusty old TV. His face, too, bore the same grotesque smile, his eyes wide and unseeing. Another note lay beside him. Laugh with me. The media had dubbed the killer the Smiling Man, and the name stuck. Rachel had seen the headlines, the grainy photos of the crime scenes, the speculation about a deranged artist with a sick sense of humor. But she knew it was more than that. The Smiling Man wasn't just a killer. He was a puppeteer, pulling strings, orchestrating his horrors with precision. And now he had made it personal. The package arrived at her apartment late one night. Inside was a black and white photograph of her asleep in her bed, the sheets tangled around her, her face peaceful in the dim light. At the bottom of the photo, the same familiar handwriting. Laugh with me. Rachel's blood turned to ice. He had been here, in her home, watching her, waiting. The thought made her skin crawl, but she pushed the fear aside. She had a job to do. The next day, she buried herself in the case files, poring over every detail, every shred of evidence. The victims seemed random, different ages, races, backgrounds, but something nagged at her, a thread she couldn't quite grasp. And then it hit her. Each victim had visited the same place just days before their murder, a dive bar downtown called The Last Laugh. It was a seedy little comedy club, the kind of place where washed-up comedians told crude jokes to half-drunk audiences. Rachel knew she had to go. That night, she sat in the dimly lit club, her eyes scanning the crowd. The comedian on stage was telling a particularly vulgar joke, his voice slurred from too many drinks. The audience laughed, but Rachel barely heard them. Her attention was fixed on the man sitting alone at the bar. He was thin, with sharp features and a permanent smirk etched onto his face. His lips curled ever so slightly upward, as if he were in on some private joke. And then, as if he could feel her gaze, he turned and looked directly at her. Their eyes met. Rachel's breath hitched. He winked, and then, as if he had been expecting her all along, he leaned in and whispered something to the bartender. Rachel couldn't hear what he said, but she didn't need to. The bartender's eyes flicked to her, wide with fear, and she knew. She's next. Rachel didn't sleep that night. Every creak of her apartment building, every rustle of the wind outside her window, set her on edge. She kept the lights on, her gun within reach, but it didn't help. The Smiling Man was out there, and he was coming for her. The next morning, she returned to the station, determined to find something, anything, that could lead her to him. She re-examined the crime scenes, the victim profiles, the notes. And then she noticed something she had missed before. Each victim had not only visited the last laugh, they had all interacted with the same bartender, the same man who had been working the night she was there. Rachel's heart raced as she pulled up his file. His name was Victor Hargrove, a drifter with a record of petty crimes. He had been working at the club for about a year, but there was something off about him. Witnesses described him as quiet, almost too quiet, with a strange habit of smiling at inappropriate times. Rachel decided to pay him a visit. Victor lived in a cramped apartment above a pawn shop, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the air smelled of mildew. Rachel knocked on the door, her hand resting on her holstered gun. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, and finally heard the sound of footsteps shuffling toward the door. It creaked open, and Victor stood there, his sharp features illuminated by the dim light of the hallway. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of mild surprise. "Detective Monroe," he said, his voice soft. "What brings you here?" "I need to ask you some questions," Rachel said, her tone firm. "About the smiling man." Victor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something dark. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. Rachel hesitated, but she stepped inside, her hand still on her gun. The apartment was cluttered, the walls covered in old photographs and newspaper clippings. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a small table in the corner. On it was a collection of handwritten notes, each one bearing the same familiar phrase, "Laugh with me." Her blood ran cold. "You," she whispered, turning to face him. "It's you?" Victor's smirk returned, wider this time, almost predatory. "I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "But you're too late, detective. The game is already in motion." Rachel reached for her gun, but Victor was faster. He lunged at her, his hands closing around her throat. She struggled, clawing at his arms, but his grip was like iron. The room spun, her vision blurring as she fought to breathe. And then, just as darkness began to close in, she heard his voice, soft and mocking in her ear. "Laugh with me, detective." When Rachel woke, she was in a dimly lit room, her hands bound to a chair. The air was thick with the smell of blood and decay, and she could hear the faint sound of laughter echoing in the distance. She tried to move, but the ropes were too tight. And then she saw him. Victor stood in front of her, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering light of a single bulb. In his hand was a knife, its blade glinting in the darkness. He was smiling, his lips stretched into that same grotesque grin. "Welcome to the finale," he said, his voice filled with glee. "You should feel honored, detective. You're the star of the show." Rachel's heart pounded as he stepped closer, the knife gleaming in his hand. She knew she had to think fast to find a way out. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about killing her. This was about making her a part of his art. And as the first cut sliced into her skin, she realized something else. The laughter she heard wasn't coming from him. It was coming from her. That Rachel's scream tore through the room, but it was drowned out by the laughter, her own laughter. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, uncontrollable and hysterical, as if her body had betrayed her. The pain was sharp and searing, but the laughter was worse. It felt alien, like it wasn't hers, as if the smiling man had reached into her soul and twisted something loose. Victor, no, the smiling man, watched her with a twisted satisfaction, his knife hovering above her skin. "There it is," he whispered, his voice dripping with delight. "The laughter. It's always there, buried beneath the fear. You just have to coax it out." Rachel clenched her teeth, trying to stifle the manic giggles that spilled from her lips. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but the ropes binding her wrists were tight, and the room was a nightmare come to life. The walls were lined with photographs, candid shots of his victims, their faces frozen in grotesque smiles. And then she saw it. A small, handheld mirror propped up on a table, angled so she could see her own reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but her mouth was curled into a smile. A wide, unnatural grin, just like his victims. What did you do to me?" She choked out between bursts of laughter. The smiling man tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Oh, detective, you've always had it in you. The laughter, the madness. I just helped it along." He held up a small vial, its contents a sickly green liquid. "A little concoction of my own design. It amplifies what's already there. The fear, the despair, and yes, the laughter." Rachel's stomach churned. He had drugged her. That was why she couldn't stop laughing, why her body felt like it was no longer her own. She struggled against the ropes, her laughter growing more frantic as he leaned in closer, the knife glinting in the dim light. "Don't worry," he said, his voice almost soothing. "It'll all be over soon, and then you'll be perfect, just like the others." The sound of a door slamming open shattered the moment. The smiling man froze, his head snapping toward the noise. Rachel's laughter caught in her throat as she saw a figure burst into the room. A man in a dark coat, his gun drawn. "Freeze!" the man shouted, his voice firm and commanding. It was Detective Marcus Hale, Rachel's partner. His eyes darted to her, then to the smiling man, his expression hardening. "Step away from her. Now." The smiling man's smirk faltered for the first time, his grip tightening on the knife. "You're too late," he hissed. "She's already mine." Marcus didn't hesitate. He fired a shot, the bullet grazing the smiling man's shoulder. The knife clattered to the floor as he stumbled back, clutching the wound. Rachel's laughter turned into a gasp as Marcus rushed to her side, cutting the ropes with a pocket knife. "Rachel, are you okay?" he asked, his voice urgent. She nodded, though her body was still trembling, the effects of the drug coursing through her veins. I can't stop laughing," she managed to say, her voice shaking. Marcus's jaw tightened. "We'll get you help. Just hang on." But before he could say more, the smiling man let out a low, guttural laugh. "You think this is over?" He spat, his eyes wild. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning." Rachel's gaze snapped to him, her laughter fading as a cold dread settled in her chest. He was reaching into his coat, pulling out something small and cylindrical. A detonator. "No!" Marcus shouted, raising his gun, but it was too late. The smiling man pressed the button, and the room exploded into chaos, the blast threw Rachel and Marcus to the ground, the force of it rattling her bones. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid, as debris rained down around them. Rachel coughed, her vision swimming as she struggled to her feet. Marcus was already up, his gun trained on the spot where the smiling man had been standing. But he was gone. "He's not here," Marcus said, his voice tight with frustration. "He must have had an escape route." Rachel's heart sank. The smiling man had planned for this. He had anticipated everything, and now he was out there, somewhere, waiting to strike again. The days that followed were a blur. Rachel was hospitalized, the drug slowly working its way out of her system. The laughter had stopped, but the memory of it lingered, a haunting reminder of how close she had come to becoming one of his victims. The police launched a manhunt for the smiling man, but he had vanished without a trace. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done with her. She saw him everywhere, in the shadows of her apartment, in the faces of strangers on the street. She knew it was paranoia, but the fear was real. And then, one night, she found something waiting for her on her doorstep. A small, neatly wrapped package. Her hands shook as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was a photograph, a picture of her and Marcus, taken just days before. At the bottom, the same familiar handwriting. "Laugh with me," and then her phone buzzed. An unknown number. A text message. You're not the only one who can play detective, Rachel. See you soon." Rachel's blood ran cold. He wasn't just coming for her. He was coming for everyone she cared about. And this time, she didn't know if she could stop him. Rachel stared at the text message, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the screen. The words burned into her mind, each one a venomous promise. The smiling man wasn't just taunting her. He was laying the groundwork for his next move. And he had made it clear, no one she loved was safe. She immediately called Marcus, her voice tight with urgency. "He's coming for you," she said the moment he answered. "He sent me a photo of us. A threat. You need to be careful." Marcus was silent for a moment, then let out a low breath. "Rachel, I'm already at the station. I got backup here. But you need to get somewhere safe." "No, I'm not the one he's after this time," she said, her voice breaking. "He's playing with me, Marcus. He's going to hurt you to get to me." "Then let him try," Marcus said, his tone firm. "I'm not letting this psycho win. We'll find him, Rachel. Together." But Rachel couldn't shake the dread that settled in her chest like a stone. The smiling man was always one step ahead. He had been in her apartment, her bed, her life. He had drugged her, tied her up, and nearly turned her into one of his grotesque masterpieces. And now he was coming for Marcus. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She paced her apartment, her gun in hand, every creak and groan of the building setting her on edge. She had installed new locks, set up cameras, and even borrowed a guard dog from a friend, a massive German shepherd named Rex. But none of it felt like enough. Around 2 a.m., her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "Tick-tock, detective. The clock is ticking." Rachel's heart raced. She called Marcus again, but this time, he didn't answer. Her stomach churned as she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Rex followed close behind, his ears perked and his eyes alert. The drive to Marcus's apartment was a blur. Rachel's mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each one more horrifying than the last. When she arrived, she found his door slightly ajar. Her breath hitched as she drew her gun and pushed the door open, Rex growling softly beside her. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the flickering glow of the television. The screen was static, the sound a low, monotonous hum. Rachel's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and then she saw him. Marcus was seated on the couch, his body slumped forward. Rachel's heart stopped as she rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. He was alive, but unconscious, and then she saw the note pinned to his chest. "Laugh with me." Rachel's blood ran cold. She scanned the room, her gun raised, but there was no sign of the smiling man. Rex growled again, his attention fixed on the hallway leading to the bedroom. Rachel followed his gaze, her finger tightening on the trigger. The bedroom door was closed, but something about it felt wrong. She approached slowly, Rex at her side, her heart pounding in her ears. When she pushed the door open, she froze. The room was a nightmare. The walls were covered in photographs, candid shots of Marcus, Rachel, and even Rex. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room was a mannequin, its face carved into a grotesque smile. It was dressed in Marcus's clothes, and in its hands was a small, handwritten note. "You're too late." Rachel's stomach turned as she realized what she was looking at. The smiling man had been here. He had taken Marcus. The next few hours were a blur. Rachel called for backup, and soon the apartment was swarming with police. But there was no trace of Marcus or the smiling man. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Rachel refused to give up. She pored over every piece of evidence, every clue, every connection. And then she found something, a receipt in Marcus's trash for a storage unit on the outskirts of town. It was dated just 2 days ago. She didn't wait for backup. She couldn't. With Rex by her side, she drove to the storage facility, her heart pounding with every mile. The unit was in a remote part of the complex, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted fences. Rachel's hands shook as she cut the lock and pulled the door open. The smell hit her first, a sickly sweet stench that made her stomach churn. The unit was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. And then she saw him. Marcus was seated in a chair, his body limp, his head tilted back. His face had been carved into a wide, unnatural grin, his lips stretched back to reveal blood-stained teeth. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. He was alive, barely, and then she heard it, a low, guttural laugh echoing from the shadows. Rachel spun around, her gun raised, but there was no one there. The laughter grew louder, more manic, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Laugh with me, detective," a voice whispered, soft and mocking. Rachel's eyes darted around the room, her finger tightening on the trigger. And then she saw it, a small, handheld mirror propped up on a table. In its reflection, she saw him, the smiling man. He was standing behind her, his sharp features twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes gleaming with madness. Rachel spun around, but he was gone. The laughter faded, leaving only silence. And then her phone buzzed. Another text. "You'll never catch me, Rachel. But don't worry, I'll be seeing you soon." Rachel's hands shook as she stared at the message, her mind racing. The smiling man wasn't just a killer. He was a ghost. And he wasn't done with her. Not yet. That Rachel's world was unraveling. Marcus was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical. The doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him, but the damage was severe, both physically and psychologically. The smiling man had left his mark, not just on Marcus's body, but on his mind. When Marcus finally regained consciousness, his eyes were hollow, his voice trembling as he whispered, "He's not human, Rachel. He's something else." Rachel didn't know what to make of it. She had seen the smiling man up close, felt his presence, heard his laughter. He was human. He had to be. But the way he moved, the way he seemed to vanish into thin air, the way he always seemed to be one step ahead, it defied logic. And now, with Marcus broken and the police force stretched thin, Rachel knew she was on her own. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and dead ends. Rachel scoured every inch of the storage unit, but there was no trace of the smiling man. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. It was as if he had never been there. The only clue was the mirror, the same one she had seen in his lair. She had it analyzed, but the results were inconclusive. The glass was old, the frame handmade, but there was nothing to tie it to him. And then, one night, Rachel's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "You're running out of time, detective. The finale is approaching." Rachel's hands shook as she stared at the screen. She was exhausted, her mind frayed at the edges, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She called the station, demanding they trace the number, but it was no use. The signal bounced off towers all over the city, making it impossible to pinpoint. Frustrated, Rachel turned to the one person she thought might be able to help. Dr. Evelyn Cross, a forensic psychologist who had consulted on some of Rachel's most challenging cases. Evelyn was brilliant but eccentric, her office cluttered with books, artifacts, and strange trinkets from around the world. When Rachel arrived, Evelyn was waiting for her, her sharp eyes scanning Rachel's face. "You look like hell," Evelyn said bluntly. "Sit down. Tell me everything." Rachel did. She told Evelyn about the smiling man, his victims, his twisted artistry, and the way he seemed to be toying with her. Evelyn listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. "He's not just a killer," Evelyn said when Rachel finished. "He's a performer, a puppeteer. He's orchestrating this entire thing, and you're the star of his show." "But why me?" Rachel asked, her voice breaking. "Why now?" Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes piercing. Because you're a challenge. You're strong, determined, and you don't give up. He's testing you, Rachel, pushing you to your limits. And when you break, that's when he'll strike. Rachel's stomach churned. So what do I do? Evelyn hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. I've been studying cases like this for years. Killers who operate like artists, who see their crimes as masterpieces. There's a pattern, Rachel, a method to their madness. And if we can figure out his pattern, we can predict his next move. Rachel took the journal, her hands trembling. You think we can stop him? Evelyn's expression was grim. I think we have to try. That night, Rachel pored over the journal, her mind racing as she connected the dots. The smiling man's victims, the locations, the timing, it all seemed random, but there had to be a pattern. And then she saw it. Each victim had been killed on a specific date, each one corresponding to a historical event tied to laughter or comedy. The first victim had been killed on the anniversary of a famous comedian's death. The second on the opening night of a legendary comedy club. And Marcus had been taken on the night of a lunar eclipse, a phenomenon often associated with madness and chaos. Rachel's heart raced as she realized what it meant. The smiling man wasn't just killing at random. He was following a timeline, a script, and if she was right, his next target would be someone connected to the next event on his list. The grand reopening of an old vaudeville theater downtown. The theater was a crumbling relic of a bygone era. Its marquee faded and its doors boarded up. But tonight, it was alive with activity. A local comedy troupe had rented the space for a one-night-only performance, and the place was packed. Rachel moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning every face, every shadow. Rex was at her side, his ears perked and his eyes alert. The show began, the audience roaring with laughter as the comedians took the stage. But Rachel couldn't focus. Her mind was racing, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. And then she saw him, the smiling man. He was seated in the back row, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering stage lights. His lips were curled into that same grotesque smirk, his eyes locked on hers. Rachel's breath hitched as she reached for a gun, but before she could move, the lights went out. The theater plunged into darkness, the audience erupting into chaos. Rachel heard screams, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor, and then laughter. Not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, but the kind that sends chills down your spine. It was him, the smiling man. Rachel pulled out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. She moved through the crowd, her gun raised, Rex growling at her side. And then she saw it, a figure standing on the stage, silhouetted against the emergency exit sign. It was him. Rachel, the smiling man called, his voice echoing through the theater. You're too late. She fired, the shot ringing out, but he was gone. The stage was empty, the laughter fading into silence. Rachel's heart pounded as she climbed onto the stage, her flashlight scanning the area. And then she saw it, a small, handwritten note pinned to the curtain. The show must go on. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She knew the smiling man wasn't done. He was still out there, waiting, watching. And now, he had taken the one thing she had left, her sense of control. But Rachel wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. She would find him, no matter what it took. And when she did, she would make him pay. The game wasn't over yet, and Rachel Monroe was ready to play. Rachel stood in the empty theater, the note clutched in her hand, the words "the show must go on" burning into her mind. The laughter still echoed faintly in her ears, a haunting reminder of the smiling man's presence. He was toying with her, pushing her to the edge, but she refused to break. Not now, not ever. She called for backup, and soon the theater was swarming with police. They combed every inch of the building, but there was no sign of the smiling man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Again, Rachel's frustration boiled over as she stormed out of the theater, Rex at her side, her mind racing. She needed a new angle, a new way to catch him, and then it hit her, the journal. Dr. Evelyn Cross had given her a key to understanding the smiling man's mind. If she could decode his pattern, she could predict his next move. Rachel spent the next 24 hours locked in her apartment, surrounded by case files, maps, and the journal. She barely ate, barely slept, her focus razor sharp. The smiling man's victims, the locations, the dates, it all pointed to something bigger, something darker. And then she saw it. The dates weren't just tied to historical events. They were tied to her. The first victim had been killed on the anniversary of her father's death. The second on the day she had graduated from the police academy. Marcus had been taken on the night of her mother's birthday. The smiling man wasn't just following a timeline. He was following her timeline. Her life. Her pain. Rachel's hands shook as she realized the truth. This wasn't just a game to him. It was personal. He had been watching her, studying her, weaving her life into his twisted narrative. And now, he was leading her to the final act. The next text came late that night. Rachel's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a single message. The grand finale awaits. Come find me. Attached was a photo, a grainy image of an old, abandoned carnival on the outskirts of town. Rachel recognized it immediately. It was the same carnival her father had taken her to as a child, the last happy memory she had of him before he died. The smiling man had chosen the location carefully. He wasn't just taunting her, he was forcing her to confront her past. Rachel didn't hesitate. She grabbed her gun, her flashlight, and her badge. Rex followed her to the car, his ears perked and his eyes alert. She called Marcus, but he didn't answer. She called the station, leaving a message with her location. But she knew she couldn't wait for backup. This was between her and the smiling man. The carnival was a ghost town, its rusted rides and crumbling booths silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the silence broken only by the creak of metal and the rustle of leaves. Rachel moved through the entrance, her gun raised, Rex growling softly at her side. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its lights flickering faintly, as if someone had turned them on just for her. Rachel's heart pounded as she approached, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then she saw him, the smiling man. He was standing at the base of the Ferris wheel, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering lights. His lips were curled into that same grotesque smirk, his eyes gleaming with madness. In his hand was a small, handheld mirror, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. "Rachel," he called, his voice soft and mocking. "I've been waiting for you." Rachel's finger tightened on the trigger. "It's over," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You're done?" The smiling man laughed, the sound low and guttural. "Oh, detective, you still don't understand, do you? This was never about them. It was always about you." Rachel's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've spent your entire life chasing shadows, Rachel, trying to make sense of the chaos. But the truth is, the chaos is all there is. And you're the perfect canvas." Rachel's mind raced as she realized what he meant. He wasn't just trying to kill her. He was trying to break her, to turn her into one of his grotesque masterpieces. "You're sick," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "And I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." The smiling man's smirk widened. "We'll see." And then he lunged. The fight was brutal. The smiling man was fast, his movements unpredictable, but Rachel was relentless. She fought with everything she had, her gun clattering to the ground as they grappled in the dirt. Rex barked furiously, his teeth snapping at the smiling man's legs, but he kicked the dog aside, sending him sprawling. Rachel's vision blurred as the smiling man's hands closed around her throat, his grip like iron. She clawed at his arms, her lungs burning as she struggled to breathe. And then she saw it, the mirror, lying just inches from her hand. With the last of her strength, Rachel grabbed the mirror and slammed it into the smiling man's face. He howled in pain, his grip loosening as he stumbled back. Rachel gasped for air, her vision clearing as she scrambled to her feet. The smiling man was on the ground, blood streaming from a gash on his cheek. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure rage. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You think you've won?" Rachel didn't answer. She grabbed her gun and aimed it at his chest. "It's over," she said, her voice cold and steady. The smiling man laughed, the sound hollow and broken. "You're wrong, Rachel. This is just the beginning." And then he reached into his coat, pulling out a small, cylindrical device. A detonator. Rachel's eyes widened as she realized what was about to happen. She fired, the shot hitting him square in the chest, but it was too late. He pressed the button, and the carnival erupted into flames. Rachel woke in the hospital, her body aching, her mind foggy. Marcus was there, his face pale but alive. He told her what had happened, how the carnival had gone up in flames, how the police had found her unconscious but alive. The smiling man's body had never been recovered. Rachel didn't know if he was dead or alive, but she knew one thing: this wasn't over. Not yet. As she lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, she made herself a promise. She would find him. She would end this, no matter what it took. The grand finale was still to come, and Rachel Monroe would be ready. Rachel's recovery was slow and agonizing. The burns on her arms and legs were a constant reminder of the fire, of the smiling man's final act of defiance. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the mental toll. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, that grotesque smirk, those hollow, gleaming eyes. He was still out there. She could feel it in her bones. The police had scoured the remains of the carnival, but there was no trace of the smiling man. No body, no DNA, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into the flames, leaving behind only ash and questions. The media speculated endlessly. Had he died in the explosion? Had he escaped? Was he even human? Rachel didn't know what to believe. All she knew was that she couldn't rest until she had answers. 2 weeks after the fire, Rachel returned to work. The station was abuzz with activity, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The smiling man had become a legend, a boogeyman whispered about in hushed tones. Rachel ignored the stares and the whispers, her focus singular. She had a job to do. Her first stop was Dr. Evelyn Cross's office. The forensic psychologist had been following the case closely, and Rachel needed her insight now more than ever. When she arrived, Evelyn was waiting for her, her sharp eyes scanning Rachel's face. "You look like hell," Evelyn said bluntly, "but I suppose that's to be expected." Rachel didn't smile. "I need your help. He's still out there." "I know it." Evelyn nodded, gesturing for Rachel to sit. "Tell me everything." Rachel did. She recounted the fight at the carnival, the explosion, the uncertainty of the smiling man's fate. Evelyn listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. "He's not just a killer," Evelyn said when Rachel finished. "He's a force of nature, a manifestation of chaos, and he's chosen you as his counterpart." Rachel frowned. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "Think about it, Rachel. He's been orchestrating this entire thing, weaving your life into his narrative. He's not just trying to kill you. He's trying to transform you, to turn you into something else." Rachel's stomach churned. "You think he wants me to become like him?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "In a sense, yes. He sees you as his equal, his opposite, the order to his chaos. And until he completes his masterpiece, he won't stop. Rachel's mind raced as she processed Evelyn's words. The smiling man wasn't just a murderer. He was an artist, a philosopher, a madman, and she was the centerpiece of his twisted vision. That night, Rachel returned to her apartment, her mind buzzing with questions. She pored over the case files again, searching for something, anything she might have missed. And then she found it, a small, seemingly insignificant detail that had been overlooked, a symbol. It was etched into the mirror the smiling man had used, a faint marking that Rachel had initially dismissed as a scratch. But now, under the light of her desk lamp, she could see it clearly, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. It looked almost like a sunburst, but there was something off about it. Rachel snapped a photo of the symbol and sent it to Evelyn, along with a message. "Do you recognize this?" The response came almost immediately, yes. It's an ancient symbol, often associated with madness and transformation. "Where did you find it?" Rachel's heart raced as she typed her reply. "On the mirror he used." "What does it mean?" Evelyn's next message sent a chill down Rachel's spine. "It means he's not done, and neither are you." The next morning, Rachel received a package at the station. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with no return address. Her hands shook as she opened it, her mind racing with possibilities. Inside was a small, handheld mirror, identical to the one the smiling man had used, and etched into its surface was the same spiral symbol. Attached to the mirror was a note, written in that same familiar handwriting. "The final act approaches. Are you ready to laugh with me?" Rachel's blood ran cold. He was still out there, and he was coming for her. The next few days were a blur of activity. Rachel worked tirelessly, following every lead, chasing every shadow. But the smiling man was always one step ahead. He left clues, a photo of her childhood home, a ticket stub from her father's favorite movie, a lock of hair that matched her mother's, but no trace of himself. It was as if he were taunting her, forcing her to relive her past, to confront her pain. And then, one night, Rachel's phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "The stage is set. The audience awaits. Come find me." Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.